I'm Sasha Nicole.
And I'm Star.
And I'm Dr. T.
This is Amerikan Therapy, the definitive podcast on all things Black mental health. And y'all, in case y'all see our clothes the same for shows we'll be putting out, we need y'all to understand this is our third show of the day, but we're going to close y'all off right. It's going to be the best show. So we are super excited. We got another great guest on this wonderful, wonderful day. So Star, lead us into what our discussion is going to be today.
So today, y'all, it's November 5th, okay, 2020. If this is in a time capsule ever somewhere. And we don't know who our next president is for those that live in the United States, these United States of America. And for us Black folks, we had this orange man who has been acting a fool for 4 years and told us he was going to act a fool. And then he went and acted a fool. And then we got another old white man who's trying to help us, but he old and white too. And he ain't perfect by far. And so we just like, what are we supposed to do? So today we're going to talk all about the election, the trauma of this election, especially on us highly melanated Black, Indigenous, brown people. What do we do? How do we heal it? What the hell do we do next? And we don't know who the president's going to
be. No, absolutely. So we have a great guest. We have Dr. Jessica Jackson, who is a licensed psychologist who divides her time between clinical practice, mental health advocacy, and research focused on racism and mental health equity. Her work has primarily focused on the psychological effects of racism, racial trauma, and stress caused by racism. In her clinical practice, she delivers culturally responsive, evidence-based treatments to adult clients with a wide range of emotional, behavioral, and adjustment problems. Dr. Jackson is an assistant professor at Baylor College of Medicine. She also has a private practice in Houston, Texas, and regularly provides local and national workshops, seminars, and webinars on culturally responsive psychological treatment. So without further ado, welcome, Dr. Jackson. We are super excited to have you. So, I mean, going ahead and digging in, your practice focus is primarily on racial trauma. Can you just start us off into some detail of what that even means? Because a lot of times people try to negate that it's not there. It doesn't exist. We don't have racial trauma. You know, I've gotten in arguments with white people who say, well, racism is taught, so I don't teach my kids those, and it doesn't even exist. And they try to make you feel like when you talk about racial trauma that it's a lie. You know, how do we just start unpacking this from the beginning of the focus of your practice and what those words even mean?
Well, I think the first thing is I'll start out when I do workshops and things, what I like to let people know is my job is not to convince you of anything. And so even today, when I'm talking to you all and anyone that's listening, that is not my job. It is not my goal. It is not even my ambition. That sounds exhausting, right? My goal is to get you to critically think about what you are thinking about, right? And when people are open-minded to that, then we can understand how racism really is impacting lives. Because I think I know for me, if I go into it like I need to change your mind, the chances of that are slim to none, right? People who have never experienced racism, it is very difficult for you to understand how it will impact me or you or the next person. And so if I spend my time doing that, I'm spinning my wheels, right? And I think at this point, it is 2020. Racism exists. And if you need someone to better explain that to you than me, there's so much research out there that says that not only does racism exist, but it impacts us in physical ways, psychological ways. There's multitudes. And people who are far smarter than me have articulated that to the entire world. And so I think when we start from that place, I'm like, we have evolved to the place of like, let's talk about how we're impacted by it, right? And I think the key word, and I'll be honest, when I first started doing this work in grad school, there was a lot of use of the word perceived racism. And it used to rub me the wrong way because I'm like, perceived, it's not my perception, it is, it's fact, this is what happened to me. But the more I've gotten into it, it's about perception in the way of, as Black people, we are not one all the time, right? So for me, I'm like, I am a Black woman who has a PhD, who comes from an upper middle class family, right? My experience is going to be vastly different from a Black woman who is 65, who came from Southern Georgia, right? Like, and so what I may perceive as racism and what she may perceive as racism is going to be different. And that's where the word perceived comes from, because our social identities intersect in a different way, right? And so I think that is a key to understanding how racism influences us and racial trauma. is really about what the resources are. I call it my backpack. Resources in my backpack are, and that's related to my life experiences. So all four of us could be sitting at a restaurant and someone could come by and ask us to get up from the table. Our life situations, our social identities are going to influence how we interpret that. And one of us may interpret it as racism, and somebody else may interpret it as something related to social class. Somebody else may just interpret it to bad manners, right? And so it's only when we interpret it and perceive it as racism is that we're impacted by it, right? And so a lot of that has to do with if your brain, and we're not conscious of it, but it will automatically let us know if we're able to cope with the situation. When we recognize we're not able to cope, we perceive it as racism when it is related to something about our race, ethnicity, discrimination, and that is how it impacts us. And so I think that is like a foundational thing to understand, which is also why I think as Black people, we don't always agree on when a situation happens if it's related to race, because we have different contexts that we're coming into the situation with.
I think that's a great way to describe it, Dr. J. Lauren, because so many times Black people have a hard time understanding why white people don't understand racism, right? Mm-hmm. So if it's different to each one of us, then of course it would be different to them. So if they were sitting at that same table with us that Dr. J. Lauren just described, they would have a different experience as well. And so when one of us said it was racist and the other one didn't, that would just feed their fuel that, see, racism isn't, so if you think about the way that she just so eloquently described it, it helps understand why white people have such a hard time. Not that, again, we're not trying to explain it to them, but we're trying to figure it out ourselves.
Right. And I think a common example is even something that has happened to many of us. If somebody puts money on the counter, right? Depending on where you're from, that can feel racist. Other people may consider it bad manners, right? So like if you pay for something and they slide your money on the counter, there's a multitude of ways to experience that. But if I experience it as racism, the way that it impacts me, I might think about it later. I may have felt like I should have said something to that person. I may have felt like I should have done something in the moment. I may later be like, why did they disrespect me? But somebody else who does not see that as a problem is not going to be fazed and impacted by it. They're going to be like, yeah, everybody around here puts the money on the counter. Like for them, how they're perceiving it, then they don't see it as racism. And that doesn't mean that they don't experience racism. That doesn't make them less Black. It just means that their cultural experience, how they interpret it, is different. And so I think when we try to have this term of racism and we try to like take ownership of it and tell somebody else what's racist and not, I mean, we also then are adding to the oppression, but understanding that where we're coming from and our life experiences and our social identities are going to impact how we feel about situations like that.
That's such a great analogy, because I am that person that if you put money on the counter, and let me go back and say, and I don't know if maybe it's trauma related, is that one of my first jobs was 14, where I was working at Chick-fil-A. So I had to take money a lot. And when a white person would put money on the counter, I perceived it as rude and racist, especially the way that they did it. Whereas, like you said, there is a possibility, I'm not saying it isn't, that in their mind, they put money on the counter for everybody. So that is a good way to kind of maybe sometimes think about the perception of stuff. And so my response would be, when I handed them back the change, I will put it on the counter. But then what I've always noticed, the reaction is that if they felt offended that I put it on the counter, then I felt like then it was intended racism. But it is something that's a good analogy in how we perceive things, because forevermore, I've always felt that way. I've always perceived like that as being like something that really bothers me. So it's like, in hearing you say that, Dr. J, is like, does that mean, and correct me if I'm wrong, that it's like how you said that even as Black people, our views sometimes on racial trauma, racism in general, and the way that we may respond to each other is also still another form of oppression in terms of race? Like, am I saying that right? I don't know. Did it make sense?
I think, so you're saying how we judge how somebody else perceives it? Is that a form of oppression?
If someone says, like when we've heard a lot of messages where people are saying, if you're Black and you support Donald Trump, then you're racist. Or if you're Black and you do this, then you're that, right? In my opinion, I think that it adds to the narrative of people not being able to think freely rather than understanding why they're thinking the way that they're thinking. So it's like, how do we take the understanding of us having those different perceptions, but then also still recognizing that the racial issues or trauma are real?
Mm-hmm. So, and I think that that's the part that people struggle with, is recognizing, like, so a way to understand that. So to answer your question is, yes, I think it still can be oppression. And I think that one of the things that we fail to realize is we individually do not own racism. And I think we forget that sometimes, right? So it's like, if I deem it this way, then it has to be this way for everybody. And that is not a fact. And so one of the things, for postdoc, I was at the VA in Los Angeles. And one of the other postdocs, Dr. Robinson, and I created this curriculum to address race-related stress with male veterans in the primary care clinic. So people who get referred from their primary care, their PCP. And in our group, what we had not anticipated was, we were in Los Angeles. We had a mix of ethnicities in the group. We had a mix of ages, veteran status. So we had people as young as in their 20s and as old as in their 80s in the same group. And what came out was, at some point, we start with these exercises in the beginning about what's your first experience with race and different things. And by the second or third session, what we found ourselves in the group having to manage was that people were telling other people that's not racist, right? So people were talking about what had happened to them and felt strongly about it. And somebody else was like, that's not racism. And that was especially happening with our Black veterans. And so it was a question of, like, we have to understand that somebody who identifies as Hispanic or Chicano or Latino who is from Los Angeles, they have their own very explicit experiences. And that's very different than somebody born in 1920 from Mississippi who's Black, right? Does not make how you interpret the experience any less valid, right? Because anybody who's discriminating against you based on the color of your skin, we're going to say that that's racism. But it's going to look very different depending on your location, your age, your life experiences, what else you've encountered. And so when we start to think about it in that way, I think that that helps people to understand, not only are we oppressing other people, but as Black people, we don't own the rights to racism, right? There are other people of color who are experiencing racism. And I think that's important. And I think that happened, that showed itself very much in COVID, with COVID-19. And when people were referring to the China virus and the Chinese virus, like, they were experiencing racism as well. And we can identify with that because we know what it's like to be lumped into a group and accused of something and then mistreated for something you have nothing to do with, right? People who are not even from China, who looked or had features that represented somewhere from China, and people were like, oh, you're the China virus. Like, no, I'm from South Korea or somewhere, right? So, I mean, and that was experiences that people had. And so we should be able to understand that. But I think there's some of us who may not have labeled it as racism, right? And may not have totally understood it.
Dr. Jackson, Dr. J. Lauren, look, we don't call you Dr. J. We call you Dr. J. We got Dr. T over here, so you're gonna be Dr. J. But like, you just brought a whole effing revelation to the table, and I'm like, literally, because my brother voted for Trump, okay? Mm-hmm. Put it on the table, right? So we have had like, and I'm a former Republican, so we've had like full on like, what? Are you crazy? Sure. But you brought a revelation in understanding that may be a really like helpful coping mechanism or tool, I don't know, listening mechanism for us to be able to hear opposing or differing views. Because I like, my observation is that, like, you're right, we don't all see, even as Black people, we don't see racism and oppression even as the same thing through each, our individual eyes. So how then could white people, now I'm not giving white people no pass, okay? Y'all don't get no pass, all right? But like, that is a freaking revelation to me, that we don't own racism. We don't own the navigation of it. But I do have the question around, so I had this conversation with a friend of mine who's indigenous American, and she was like, you posted something about whiteness, and I'm writing a book, so it's like I'm trying to like just spew and just let things out. But like she was like, oh, I'm very offended because you're talking about whiteness in the construct of Black people, and you didn't even mention Indigenous people. And we've talked about this on the show with Dr. T. Sasha about how in white supremacy we're taught there's only an or, there's not an and. And so how do we even engage each other as different communities of color, different types of Black people, to not be like, I invalidate what you feel because I feel, you know what I'm saying? I feel my way, and be able to support each other, but still be like, no, I'm gonna talk about Black people because that's what I'm going through.
Right. Well, I think the thing is to be explicit. So I know in my writing, in my research, I'm explicit about Black people. And then when I mean people of color, then I say that. But I think like one of the terms, I mean, people can use whatever term they want to identify. And whenever I have patients, I call them patients at the hospital, clients in private practice, whenever I meet with people, I ask them, how do you identify? Because that's important, right? And then understanding that when I'm explicitly giving presentations and workshops, I typically am explicitly talking about Black people, and I note that. However, what has happened is people feel comfortable sometimes putting them all together. So you'll hear POC, people of color, more recently BIPOC, Black, Indigenous people of color. And I'm like, but we don't all have the same experience. So when you lump it together, right, I find that very hard because I'm like, the similarity might be that we are literally physically people of color, but all of our experiences are going to be different. So when people write articles and they write research, I'm like, how are you saying all BIPOC people are the same? And so to answer your question, I think it is important to be very explicit when we're talking about Indigenous, we're talking about Native, when we're talking about Asian Americans, when we're talking like where they're from. I went to grad school in New Mexico, and even when we lump people who identify, like that's why I use the word Chicano and Latino and Hispanic, South American, it's very different. And when I worked in the hospital there, everyone knows the census, right? I'd have to ask them a question and I'd say, do you identify as Hispanic or non-Hispanic? And there were people who get really mad and be like, no, I'm from Brazil, I'm not Hispanic. Like, and I'm like, well, it's just a question. For me, it was a question on the form, but I can understand they're like, I am not this. And the fact that you did not ask me that correct question or acknowledge it is invalidating, right? And so I do think even as Black people, we have a duty, a responsibility. We know what it's like to feel invalidated, right? Black people, Black Americans are very different from people from Africa, African Americans, from the Caribbean, right? From Europe. And so I personally use the term Black for that reason, because I'm like, I know a Black American experience. I cannot pretend to know African American experience from Africa or Caribbean American experience. I can ask, but I can't speak for all of them because we have a different experience.
Yeah, we talk about that a lot on the show, but then it's so hard because we're always doing the lumping and the splitting. Because even in the Black American experience, there's so much diversity. We've talked about that. Yeah. Amongst even the three co-hosts of this show, and I'm sure Dr. J. Lauren, it wouldn't be any different if we threw you in as the fourth, that the Black person's experience is rural versus urban versus class versus education. And all of those slithers make the Black American experience just as diverse as every other experience, but we still feel forced, I think, to speak with one voice. And that then leads to all of these confusions and problems and pitting us against each other. Well, she said, my other friend said that wasn't racist when I said that to her. So you're just being sensitive, right? And then, so now you're pitting the Black people against each other. Right. And so it's hard. Doesn't mean we don't need to work on it, push through it and figure it out, but it's hard to figure out how to combat racism when people will then use that as an excuse to invalidate it.
Right. I think that's one of the reasons personally, I think the way to do workshops and things has come from a social identity lens. Because I think the one thing that all people of color have an experience is, in order to get racism is power, and it's prejudice, and power is racism. So I can be prejudiced against other people, but I have no power to enact anything, right? And as a group, we do not have power in the government. We do not have power most of the time at our jobs. You lack the power. So when people also say something is not racist, I'm like, or they tell me I'm racist as a Black person, I'm like, I can be prejudiced all day. I have no power to do anything. I cannot stop you from getting housing. I cannot stop you from getting this job. And so I think when people recognize that as their overarching for racism, and then my thing is like, when we're trying to understand it on a deeper level, go from social identities. And that's what we did in the group. When people can understand their own social identities, they can also understand how privilege can be fluid, right? And one of the things that I help people to understand, especially in my workshops, is think about it. For all of us, and this will be an assumption, so correct me if I'm wrong, ladies, when you come through a door, we all walk through the door, correct? Do we ever, every time we walk through the door, stop and think, somebody with a wheelchair cannot get in this door? There's somebody excluded from this room because of the width of the door, right? There's somebody excluded from this room because they're too tall for the door, right? We just walk through. Our social identity allows us to have some privilege in that because we're able-bodied, right? And so I think when we understand it from that way, we can understand how some people may not be considering our experience all the time because we're not considering the experience of everybody else all the time, right? And I think that teaching people that can then help them to be open to understanding, yes, no matter how good of a person you are, no matter how good your intentions are, you are still missing something, and somebody is oppressed because you're missing something in your lack of awareness, because we all are guilty of it. However, I don't have any power, and that's the difference in racism. So even though I can walk through the door, I do not have power to keep you out of the room. I'm just able to walk in the room and not recognize that you can't get in.
So Star, we mentioned earlier, we wanted to touch base on just currently the stresses and anxiety of the election. And you mentioned that your brother voted for Trump. Did he ever mention why? Because I think that'd be a good segue in understanding with this conversation, him being a Black man, he has Black daughters, he's married to a Black woman. What was, and he's not, and I'm just throwing this out there because we also identify Blackness via our colorism.
He's very light. My brother is very
light, but his wife is dark.
Very
he has
dark.
children who are dark. So it's like, what?
I mean, so we had, I'm just going to, and my brother does listen to the show. He works at Metro for those in DC, and like everyone at Metro listens. So I'm sure he's going to be like, this is what we do. I mean, we've had several conversations. This is not like yesterday. This is like yesterday I was out there screaming, lock him up. But that was my, I'm still a work in progress. I'm meditating and praying on myself. So his justification to me over multiple conversations has been, he felt, and I've heard this from other Black men, he felt that crime bill and Biden and Kamala Harris, Kamala Harris, I want to get it right. I'm from the South, so but he felt like they were just basically, those are the same, they have the same intention as a Trump. I'd rather have a person who will tell me who he is, how he is, and then I can navigate accordingly versus someone who's just trying to smile in my face and screw me at the same time. Additionally, my brother is a union worker. He's an elevator mechanic, which is the highest paid union job in this country. So he has also another paradigm. He's one of the very few Blacks, very few minorities, but very few Blacks that is in that trade. He's like very high up in his trade and his craft. So he has like a feeling of like jobs are important. And Trump really did a great job of speaking to the working class union worker type person. And one of my observations from those conversations was that my brother and maybe some of his peers, there is a sense of fear because there's like this Joe Biden and all these fancy suited and booted Democrats, they're talking about handout. And I'll be honest, a lot of Black people who are union employees who are like, consider themselves like hardworking Americans, they are not for what they would call handouts. I don't call them handouts, but that was his, I'm not for handouts. I get up and work every day. I have 3 kids, a wife. I work, I do what I got to do, and I make it work, and everyone else should as well. But he really didn't. He was like, I don't trust Kamala Harris, and I don't trust Joe Biden. And part of me, this is my perception, he gonna hear this or whatever, we're gonna have another argument, was that I think there was a level of sexism. a level of, because he didn't vote for Hillary either. There was a level of like, and I feel like a lot of men are like that, but that's my take.
So, and Dr. T, Dr. J, when because you mentioned it, Dr. J, I believe, and sometimes our perception of race is based on class as well. Like if you come from an upper middle class Black family as opposed to someone who comes from the most stricken poverty of Black family, your perception of how you view others or how you view race can be drastically different. So how do we, so now we have this angst. We don't know who our president is yet. But then how do we deal with that because now a lot of us are in fear. And I know for me, one of my thoughts have been, should I go anywhere that's considered Trump land if he doesn't win? And then if he does win, if he does win, I'm gonna be honest. I feel more comfortable sometimes with him winning on the basis of the places that I may have to go or the people that I may have to interact with, because I feel like if he doesn't, it seems as though there will be just this onset, and it could be media propaganda, because one thing I do agree with Trump is that the media does take things and sensationalize them. I do agree with him on that. And so I don't know if I'm creating fears in my head based upon media being sensationalized, or if it's a real anxiety, but then I also have fears that, okay, if Biden wins, I'm gonna be taxed out the ass. Now I ain't in that some of them bracket levels, so certain things ain't gonna hit me. I'm still below that little bracket. Mm-hmm. But I also kind of feel like Starr's brother felt like, and I didn't vote for Trump, but I also feel like I felt like at that voting table, I felt mad. I feel like, God damn, I gotta pick one. I can't pick him, so I'm just gonna have to go ahead and pick. And I mean, so I feel like there's a lot of people who feel that way. And maybe they won't talk about it, but then you have those who are staunch, no, go blue, Democrat. And if you don't vote Democrat, as Biden said, you ain't Black. What'd you do?
Well, I think the one thing to speak to something that you just said, a lot of people felt that way. I've heard thoughts of people saying, I felt like I had to choose, and it's like the lesser of two evils almost. And my thought about that is, you're human. We pick the lesser of two evils every day. Nobody wants to work every day, right? There are times that all of us work up and they're like, I don't actually want to go to this job, but you do it, right? Because you need to pay bills, you need to eat, right? You need to do all of these different things. And so my thought is, how is the election any different? And I've seen this one kind of analogy floating around social media about picking a politician is not marriage, it's like public transportation. You get on the bus that's going closest to where you're going, right? You're not committed and loyal to them forever. And I think that's it. And so for me, I didn't understand, and to be honest, I still don't, when people say, oh, we can all have valid feelings, right? And be frustrated about things. But I'm like, every day, do I want to eat vegetables with every meal? No. Would I like to eat ice cream some days and still not gain weight? Absolutely. Is it possible? No, right? Because it's not realistic. So I'm like, we make these choices every day. And somehow it came to the election and we were like, no, this feels unfair to make this choice. I'm like, you do it every day, sometimes multiple times a day, right? You have conversations with people that you don't want to talk to, right? You maybe in a relationship, whether it's a family or a partner or a friendship, with people that get on your nerves, but you still like, and they call you for something and you do it because you're like, okay, right, I'm going to help that person out. I didn't understand how that was different for the election. Because yes, it is essentially the lesser of two evils, and it is not a forever thing. And we make those choices every day. And I think something else that you spoke to is about the handout situation. And I get confused about that too. When people say we get handouts, and I'm like, anybody who is employed by an employer where you get benefits, they pay part of your insurance. They pay for part of your days. Like you get, when you look at the definition of a handout, when people get upset, like, oh, they're getting something and not working for it. Even when you have health insurance, you don't pay your full health insurance as an employee. Somebody's paying for part of it. What would you call that? Right? It's not something that you have earned. They're saying as a part of a job, we will offer to pay this and you pay this. And so I think when people think about a handout, they think about government for reasons that are rooted in Reagan and a lot of socio-political stuff and a lot of racism, frankly. People think welfare when they think handout. And I'm like, you get a handout on a regular basis in many, many situations. And if we reframed it as not as a handout, as we all need help, there are very few people in this country, let alone this world, who pay for everything out of pocket all the time, on time. So when someone gives you money to help you to do something, to help you to get ahead, that is the equivalent of what you would get when you get a stimulus check, when you get a quote unquote handout, when you get something from the government.
But
And
then
I think if people,
I guess I got the question because first of all, I needed you in my arguments because I'd have been like, but I would say this, like, so how do we deconstruct all of this shit in our head that's got us thinking and finding, it almost feels like we're finding ways to like tier ourselves, like, well, I'm over here because I get up and work every day, or I'm over, like which to me, I just read the Willie Lynch letters last week again, and it was so pressing on me that literally there was a system designed to make us, to teach us and make us look at each other as other. Even though we were all being oppressed, we were all being tore up and beat up and done all wrong, to make us try to find any slither of otherness in each other. How the hell did we then now, I ain't gonna talk about white people, how do we deconstruct that within ourselves before we could ever have a conversation with white people?
Well, I whenever I have this conversation, I think of one of my mentors, Dr. Carl Bell, who's passed away, that he talked about the plantation mentality over and over and over again, even in academia or anywhere where Black people feel like there is a pyramid, which there is, for Black people. They're only going to let so many of us to those higher echelons. So we're in competition with each other in the plantation mentality, rather than the plenty mentality, where all of us can be successful. All boats rise with the tide, right? We don't use that mentality because, well, we did come from the plantation where that was our reality for a very, very long time. And so it's very hard to take something that has been ingrained in DNA and in thinking and in culture and just turn it off. Even though we know it's not true, and even though we know that we can support each other, it's incredibly difficult to turn that off. And I think that's part of the reason. And you think about all the years of people trying to assimilate, right? If I act more white, or if I believe or perceive or function in a more white manner, then I am not like those people who the whites hate. So they will hate me less, or maybe they might even like me one day. And so all of these twisted machinations that we do in our heads just to try to survive each and every day. These are all defense mechanisms to try to help us get up and keep moving and walk through this difficult thing called being Black in America.
And I think, like, even taking it a step further and being transparent is one of the first steps that we do that as Black people, and you all weigh in on your thoughts, is the organizations that we join. And I mean, like, me being quite frank, there have been organizations that I have specifically joined on the basis of wanting to be one of the 1/10ers, of Black people because of where I came from. And I wanted to enter those rooms because we do have a different class level within our Black societies. And I'm in some organizations where we'll say, we want to help the community as long as the community don't sit with us. So, we helping, we contributing, we doing a whole lot of work in the community, but let them, let some of that community, be like, well, can I come to your house?
Like, or can I date your daughter?
Right. No, we don't. No. Here it is a gift basket.
Yes.
Here's the community. I'm going to go now to the other side of the bridge and go back to my community. And so, and we don't talk about that and we don't acknowledge that. But I hate to use like it's a goal, but for me, what I've looked at it as is that I didn't come from certain legacies. I didn't come from certain money. So for me, it's kind of been like, well, maybe I can have my daughter be a part of certain things I didn't have so that she can have access to things that I didn't, because the way that the world works, whether we like it or not, is that sometimes having access is a great way to network, have different relationships. Sometimes it's that, like when we think about that case with the white boy who had raped the white girl, it was flat out rape. And he, I think, forgot he was on a swim team or something, went to an Ivy League school. And the access that he had and the people that his father, his family knew was, how a lot of times we see certain things where these families, these people, they know the attorneys, they know the judges. And we have the same thing that exists smaller, much smaller in our Black communities, that we don't really oftentimes acknowledge how we contribute to that problem. But, white people have the same thing too, because my mom, who's considered poor white trash, white people they don't like white trash either. So, I don't know, Dr. J, what you give these trainings, where do we start from a training perspective, not only for others, but even for ourselves?
Self-compassion. I think when we recognize that we're human, our brains are created. We divide and categorize everything. Think about how you cook food. Think about how you put it on your plate. Like, that's what your brain does. And I think there's nothing wrong with that. There's also nothing wrong with ambition. So even when we accuse white people of saying, you did all these things for your child, it's survival. We would do the same thing for our children if we had access, right? And so I think when we can understand where people's motivations are coming from, it might help us to then be able to speak to that, right? We speak to the gap, speak to the void. And so even when we talk about categorization, everybody wants to belong. I worked in jails and prisons. I took criminal justice classes. A gang is no different from the PTA. People want to belong. There's a leader. There are people who do the things, right? Who say, this is what we're going to do. That we as society has just deemed one as legitimate and one the other not, right? People join Girl Scouts, people join the swim team, people join the church choir, people have their own Mean Girls clique. All of us want to belong. We all belong to something, right? And when we can recognize that sense of belonging and that sense of wanting to be involved, I think that helps us to then love on one another and say, hey, how do we help each other do this? How do we connect with someone, right? I think one of the analogies I hear all the time for DE&I, diversity, inclusion, and equity, is people like, diversity is being invited to the dance, and inclusion is being asked to dance. But I'm like, okay, can we also recognize that we're human? We don't ask people to dance that we don't know, right? At the end of the day, right? So am I telling people, oh, yeah, I invited you to the party. We have all been to somebody's housewarming, somebody's kickback, somebody's party, and you stand against the wall. It's not that you weren't invited. It's not that people didn't try to speak. People don't talk to people they don't know, and that's something we all do. So my thing is also like, how do we help each other to get to know each other in a way that people ask us to dance, or that we take initiative and ask somebody to dance, right? And I think a part of that, I'll be honest, is I'm a fan of womanist culture, and being that like, I don't have to get a seat at the table if I can make my own table, create my own table. And so I also am like, let's take some of that power back. I can ask somebody, right? And I think a part of that is racial socialization. I'm working on a project with a colleague who is at Stanford now, and we're talking about how do we talk to our kids and parents and teach them how to do racial socialization with their kids? How do we have pride, racial socialization? How do you have pride? How do you learn how to be as a Black boy or girl and be okay with it? Because when they have confidence, then they can go into these rooms, they can, what you were saying, they can want to be part of these things and be ambitious and bring people with them. They may not feel that competitiveness, right? And we also know that racial socialization is a protective factor against racial trauma and racism. That when kids, Black kids, know what their identity is, they feel good in their identity, they know what it means. What does it mean to be Black? What does it mean to have culture? That they actually fare better. It's the same thing with new research that's showing that people who are activists and engaged in do marches and things, they feel less stressed, less depressed, less angry than people who are not, right? And so I think there's nothing wrong with belonging and ambition, like you were saying, Sasha, but I think that it is being able to recognize that other people are struggling in the same way. And so it's like, if I can understand why it's struggle for me and I can understand why it's a struggle for them, then I can reach my hand out across that bridge and have a conversation, right? I can understand why this person wanted to join a gang because I wanted to join the Girl Scouts or the PTA or the swim team. And so instead of judging them, now I can understand you just wanted to you wanted to be a part of, right? And that changes things. That breaks down walls. That helps me to have a conversation.
That's
In addition, in addition, it's like we have to remember, I have been really encouraging people to remember the and, because it doesn't have to be either or. And so many times it's like one choice is right. And it's like, if you're in a situation where the gang, for instance, is the best sense of belonging and protection, then that's a false choice to say, well, you didn't have to join a gang. Maybe you really did. And maybe that really was the best choice to help you survive and thrive and give you the best chance to move to a future of something that was different. So we have to remember that these choices are not either or, and they're not based on our own perception of what may be right or wrong. And I think that's part of what makes it so difficult to communicate our feelings, our desires, our needs, because we have to consider because the different advantages and or disadvantages that each person has is why they make the choices they make. And I have worked with a lot of people. I've worked with some unfortunate young men in the correctional system, young men, not like adults, but young men who, if they had other choices, they have dreams, they have aspirations, but in the situations they're in, the choices they made were the best ones. And it's hard to argue that, but they will be looked down upon for the rest of their life because of those choices. And so if we're doing that to ourselves as a community, then we know that white people are doing it to us as a community. And so it's like we have to start the conversation somewhere.
Right.
I do.
And I think,
go ahead, Doctor. No, go ahead. Come on. No, come on.
I was gonna say, I think the other thing is just to also recognize that, again, we can, to what Dr. T was saying, the both and, right? And I believe in the end. My friends make jokes about it all the time because they're like, Jessica's always like, and this thing can happen, because I think it's true. We're human and we all have preferences. And so I think we conflate the two when we say, if you have a preference, if you choose something, that's racism. Remember that racism has to have power in it. But we all have choices. We have a preference in the type of people that we date. We have a preference in the type of people we marry. We have a preference in the type of job that we take, and we don't see a problem with that. And I think what happens is we intellectualize racism too much. And so we say it has to meet these thoughts when we don't go to the feeling to understand, because the feeling is there's a choice, there's a preference, right? Except I don't have power. So if I only want to date men with curly hair, I don't have power to stop all men from curly hair from existing and not dating, but I'm still allowed to have a preference, right? So I can understand that part of it, but I don't have the oppressive part. I can't say you don't exist anymore. And so when we can acknowledge that, I think that helps too, the and part, because we all have a preference. We all have things that are like, I wouldn't do that, right? So we can understand how other people would feel about it.
I think my only last kind of thought here was, and a question really is, I think what I'm finding challenging, I'm a mindfulness teacher, a meditation teacher, and I'm even challenged with this at this point in time, that with this, I hate to say awakening, but many of us are just becoming aware for some reason of like the construct of racism. And I'm talking about us as Black people, like having this full awakening that this is a system and a structure and intentional. Being that we're getting that awakening or having that full on in your face, like, okay, this is it. How then, as an oppressed person, do you then create space within yourself to then cultivate enough compassion and vulnerability? And I love that you Dr. J, you use those words and that specific language, but then how do you create space in yourself while being continuously oppressed to be able to do that? And I think that's where a lot of our community is really, really, really struggling.
Mm-hmm. I would say self-reflection and connecting to your networks. Because first I would say, who is it that's just having this awakening? And I guess it's a very specific type of group of Black people, right? Because we know when we look at all of the data, looking at race-related stress, racial trauma, because of racial socialization, people who are much more connected to their Black community are experiencing it less. So students at HBCUs are experiencing it less than students at PWIs, who are the only ones in their class, who are the only one in the student group. When you look at the higher that we rise in corporate America and in our jobs as Black people, we feel the impact of racism more because we're less connected. We might be the only one in the meeting, the only one on the team, the only one in our department, right? So you're a lot more aware of it versus when I am someone who is entry level and there's 10 other people that look like me, I have a group, I can talk to them about it. So maybe we're aware of it, but I'm less impacted because I have a support group. There's people that I can talk to about it. And so for the people who feel like they're just waking up to it or experiencing it, my thought is, A, self-reflect. How connected are you to other people who are experiencing that? Because that's a big part of it. But also, how can you create that group? So even if it's not people in your department or your division, for myself, at work, I am the only one in my clinic who is Black. So I connect with people who are not a part of my clinic because I know from self-awareness, hyper aware of what's happening. There isn't someone I can talk to on a daily basis like, girl, did you see that this just happened, right? I'm just taking it by myself every day. So when I connect with other people, they may not know my job specifically or the people, but they can understand. And so when people are looking to create that space and that self-compassion, I'm like, a part of it is you have to have a network, a soft place to land, right? Who are your friends, whether your girlfriends, whether people in your field who are just like your work friends, we have a work best friend and those type of things. Who is your soft place to land so you can talk about it and not have to take it on all yourself? Because that's when I feel like we erupt and we feel frustrated and we're holding it because there's no one to share it with, right? And I think Zora Neale Hurston said it best. I use this all the time in therapy. There's no greater pain than an untold story. So you're walking around with all of those pains and all those microaggressions, all those things that you don't get to share with other people, that's painful, like that's exhausting, and you're in constant distress.
With that said, I think my only last question would be, when you do the studies and you talk about the compassion preference, things like that, is it wrong? And I know this is subjective, but can you walk in a space, when we talk about the dichotomy, like of the Black versus white, but really in this conversation of seeing that it also exists within our own, culture, can you go through that space being Black and saying, this is my preference? Can you go through that space being white and saying, I'm not racist because I'm not enabling or supporting power against you. I just prefer that I just not be around you because that's just my preference, but we perceive preference as wrong, even when we talk about like body types, men, women that we like, you'll hear a community say, if a man says, I don't like big women, it's like, that's his preference, but he didn't say he would be unkind or that he hates. That it's just in who he prefers to date. I have my preferences for certain types of dudes. So it's
the one you're married to, right?
Y'all know my beliefs on
for rich men. I prefer rich men. Is that bad?
I prefer more than man. That's what I prefer. That's what I prefer. I love us for real. So anyway, I'm gonna keep it at that. But anyway, that can you is that normal to feel? Is that okay? When we think about this election and and I give the example, I was doing gun shooting and there was a white guy who even had like certain tattoos that I was like, oh, he gotta be a supremacist. Like, and he was real funky acting in the beginning. Like, but towards the end and having conversation, it seemed like his perception or his energy changed. And not to say that, oh, he was a fan of Black people, but it just was like, perhaps his perception of what Black people are represented maybe was different. I don't know. But is it okay to have that preference?
Personally, I think yes. I think, again, the self-awareness. So if my preference is I don't like men, am I in a place of power to keep men out of the room? Because then that's when it becomes a problem, right? So I can prefer, right? Think about even with coworkers in general, those are not your chosen friends. There are people that you all got hired, and some you prefer to hang out with, or some coworkers you will go to happy hour with, and others you'd be like, no thanks, right? But you still work with them, but you're not in a place of power to keep them out of their job, to keep them out of space. So I think when we have self-awareness of how our preference is impacting someone, it's okay. Because I have coworkers, I think we all do, that, you cordial, you work with them. Am I ever going on vacation with you? No. Am I going to happy hour with you or going to your house? No. But I don't stop you from doing your job. I don't stop you from getting opportunities. I don't stop you from, so I think when we have that self-awareness. And I think the other piece to think about with that is also when we are thinking about how we're judging people, and when I was saying about compassion, our feelings are data, right? And so and here's the thing, feelings are not facts, but they're data, which is different. So I can feel some sort of way and I can validate that. And I think people get confused. Validation does not mean I agree. It just means I hear what you're saying. So I can feel some sort of way about somebody. I can feel angry towards somebody. I can be mad that my sister came and slammed the door, right? Okay, she can validate that. I can understand why you're mad. It doesn't make it facts. It doesn't mean you should be mad because I slammed the door, right? It just means I can understand it. And in understanding that, she can also say, well, that's data for me. What made me so angry about the fact that she slammed the door, right? So when you have a preference, when you feel like someone's a white supremacist, when you feel something, that is data that is giving you information about something. It doesn't make your feeling valid. I mean, yeah, it doesn't make it facts, but it does give you data. And you can acknowledge that I feel some type of way. What is this telling me, without saying this is an actual fact of the situation? And I think that's an important part to remember, right? Because we all get upset about something and then later we're like, I don't even know why I was so upset about that, right? It wasn't a fact. We just were really upset. And as soon as somebody told us to calm down, that made us more upset because they didn't validate it. They didn't say, I can understand why you're upset. Because when people say that, we immediately are like, yeah, right, you understand. Doesn't mean they're agreeing with us. They're just saying, as soon as they tell us to calm down, we go up 10 notches, right? Because we're not validated. So I think remembering that it gives us data. So yes, it's okay to have a preference, to recognize what that preference is telling us, to recognize when we're feeling some way about someone, like the man that you saw to choose white supremacy. It gave you data that maybe you were more on guard, but it wasn't a fact because you talked to him and it changed things. But it did help you to maybe be more on guard in your interaction with him, because then your antenna is up. I'm feeling something that's not a good feeling.
That's great. Is there anything, maybe as we close out, that just any last words you want to leave, that you'd want to say, and also maybe any tidbits, as we're still waiting to find out who our next president is? Just any last words that you would want to give the listeners?
I think, and this is kind of on brand for me, to remember that we're human. You're gonna get it wrong. It's a fact, right? We're going to get wrong how we feel. We're going to get wrong what we think as we wait for the election, how we interpret things, how we talk to other people. And so I think when we remember that we're human and that sometimes things are not going to go the way that we envision, I think that that's helpful, right? There is no right way to cope, right? There is no perfect coping. I know there's tons of articles on self-care and coping, and I think we have been oversaturated with coping, right? Sometimes you just got to feel. And so that is also what's happening with the election. If there's something that works for you, baking, cooking, a glass of wine, going running, great, do it. Also, it's totally okay if none of those things work for you and you just have to feel what's happening, because I think that that's okay too. And we minimize that when we focus on coping. Coping is saying, I have to learn how to get through this. It's okay to be present with whatever is happening and experience that. And I think we overlook that part, right? That it's okay for me to be sad or angry or resentful or nervous, and sit with that. I don't have to cope. I don't have to do anything with it. I can just acknowledge that I'm feeling that way. And I think that's the thing I would leave, is to let people know you don't have to have a self-care routine and coping and all of that for everything, because you're human. You don't know what life is going to throw at you at any given point. You cannot always be prepared, and it's okay to just experience it's okay to not be okay, basically.
Absolutely. Dr. T, what say you?
This week, I would challenge people to amplify the ands in their life. The ands. It is okay in this moment to not understand how someone else feels about racism, to be tired of explaining racism, to be angry that you still have to explain racism. I've heard many people say, like, I'm shocked that the election is this close. And I have to stop myself because I'm like, why are you shocked? Like, America is functioning exactly the way it was supposed to function. Why are you shocked? But I have to remember that's where they are on their journey. And so we can all appreciate that we're at different spots. It doesn't make where I am any less important or valid than where you are. What I don't want you to do is get stuck. I don't want you to get paralyzed, right? If the and is supposed to help you accept and incorporate and then continue your path forward. So I want this week for everyone to amplify the and continue your path forward.
Mm-hmm. And if I may add, Dr. T, I think also what she's saying is also, you don't have to attend every argument you're invited to, right? Mm-hmm. That you can just say, right?
I get invited to arguments very often.
Right. but you know, when people are saying, when you say you don't have to explain yourself.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
You don't have to, because that's going to happen with the election, and people are going to say things. And I think no is a complete sentence. Thank you is a complete sentence. Silence is a way of communicating, nonverbal. And I think if people remember that, you don't have to participate every time somebody says anything to gaslight.
Absolutely. Star, what's your 2 things? I know you got 2. You might even got 3.
You know, I really, really love today's conversation because it touches in the realm of being present, being mindful, self-awareness, and the power. So my first thing is going to be about taking back our own power. And we do that by being present. We can do that by being self-aware. And like you said, just engaging our feelings. Stop all. I have to agree. There's an industry, a cottage industry being built now slowly around coping and self-care and and it's great. It's absolutely wonderful. But you know, like, we're human, so we do everything to the extreme until it's like not great for us. So my first thing is just, you know, it's okay not to be okay, and just cultivating a radical level of self-awareness and presence is probably going to be the most transformative thing we can all do right now. You know, as we radically reimagine America, either way, regardless of who the hell ends up, we're at an apex, and so something is going to drastically change. And then, you know, the second thing I'm going to say ties right into that with, like, you know, y'all know I like to go deep and all that and spaced out stuff. But like, I really think this is the point where America, and for us, it will give us so much power to be able to connect to the universal principle of oneness, and to really delve way deep into it and start to understand, what does that mean? And that I can have this perspective, and that you can have a perspective that's like just a shade to the left of mine, but we can come to that narrow nuance could completely change how we look at each other. It could make me hate you. You could hate me, given how we're socialized, and just trying to find space for oneness so that we can understand that we are, and I'm not into the kumbaya. I was listening to the show. I'm about fight the power, keep the peace, fight the power, stay dangerous. But I think if we get to the point where we can start to engage oneness and engage the possibility that we all have different perceptions, which I love this conversation. This is like transformative. Then that may help us to then walk into the step of, I don't even have to agree with you. I can just see that you have a completely different perspective because of how you're socialized, what have you. You're on a different slant, but you're still going through the same shit as me. You still have trauma, you still have fear, you still have all these things you have to deal with. You're just sitting on a different angle. And then I encourage, like we always talk every week, maybe I have 3 things today. Okay. But I would say that I love that we talk about those that are engaged and activated and activists. It is also a really awesome, I hate to say coping, but a healing mechanism. Because if you are static, if you are not moving and the world is moving around you, that in and of itself is a trauma. So.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. Everyone has added some great points. I think, I don't have a lot to say in closing. I just piggyback everyone. And I think I would just add the last word of just humanity. And I think that sometimes we often forget the humanity of each other, but also even within ourselves. One thing that you said, Dr. J, is like, we make mistakes. We have regression. I know when I was in therapy earlier and I was like, but I did this and I knew it was wrong and I shouldn't have done it. And I was upset because I'm like, I've made all this progress. And my expectation was that regression wouldn't happen with progress. And my therapist was like, well, regression is kind of part of the process. Like, it'll happen. Yeah. It's what you do once you regress. So, I understood it, I received it. And so, those are the things that I think we just have to look at: the humanity, the regression, but then what we do with that and how we move forward. And as Star mentioned, as Dr. T have said, this has just been a great conversation. We appreciate you, Dr. J. Thank you for coming on. Dr. J. Lauren on social media, right?
Yeah.
Dr. J. Lauren on social media, follow her. And follow us, Amerikan Therapy with the K. We're so excited to have had you on for this wonderful and rich conversation. And hopefully, maybe, we might know who the president is soon. And if not, we'll
before that.
Yeah, who cares? We don't need a president anyway. So, but we love you, we thank you, and we out.
Thank you.